Good morning and welcome to the first session of this final day of our summer school. The 2 weeks seem to have gone very quickly, which is, I think, a very good sign about the quality of the presentations that we've heard. So this morning, we have the privilege to hear from two of the directors of the summer school, Jerónimo Maillo and Marta Villar, who are going to talk about public aid for economic recovery and the ecological transition in Europe. So the floor is now yours, Jerónimo and Marta.
Thank you very much, Joanne. So the first block of this session, I will be talking about the scenario of public aid in the last years and the current situation. I'm more than entering into the detail of all the tools and how they have been implemented. My idea is to give an overview of the changes that we have been living and we are still living in this field in the last years. Because I anticipate one of my conclusions is that we are in a field in which, once more probably, we are seeing tectonic changes. And we are seeing also a mix of tools, an interaction between these tools at national level, European level, and global level. And I think one of the most interesting issues precisely is the fact that we are now having or going to have these three levels also in the public aid sphere. And that, of course, implies that we have to look and to think about coherence between that internal and external side, and we have to think about the intersections between the three of them. So, to start with, the departing point, of course, is the need of extraordinary public funding and public aid as well during the pandemic, during the economic recovery in which we are still, and of course that has been aggravated with the war in Ukraine. So no doubt that we have very exceptional circumstances, very important crisis that required an extraordinary use as well of public funding. All countries have needed and are still needing that increase in public spending to face the different crises and the impact of those crises in companies and in citizens. And we have a legal framework for public aid, for controlling that public aid, which is different at the three levels. At member state level, what we have is a strict supervision. That was the general framework, a strict supervision of state aids. As you all know, the European Union has a very intense control and supervision of state aids by member states that is not common in other global jurisdictions, in other jurisdictions like the US or China or other antitrust jurisdictions. And this, of course, is special because of the, I think, special circumstances as well of the European Union and how competition policy was introduced, linked to the single market and linked to the integration process in Europe. We needed to centralize the control not only of private restraints, but also of public restraints, and particularly of state aids, to avoid or to prevent economic and political tensions between the member states, due to the fact that we we're building a single market. So if we help one company, that company is operating in the single market. So if one state helps that company, the other companies of other member states, or even the other member states, of course, will have a possibility to complain, or may complain because there is a distortion of competition in the single market, and that requests a centralized supervision at EU level. So this strict supervision, I insist, is only for national level, and it does not exist for in other jurisdictions. The second level is European Union aid, so European funds, not national funds. And here we don't have a similar screening mechanism for granting aid. There is an internal control, of course, and an EU political decision about it. Of course, within that political decision-making and implementation and enforcement, we have some mechanisms to lay down conditions for that aid. The EU sets priorities, sets goals, sets objectives, and then it also puts some conditions to implement the aid. And of course, later on, it controls how this aid is being granted. The third level is foreign subsidies. And regarding foreign subsidies, I'm saying subsidies given by third countries, that was practically non-existent. I mean, at WTO level, there was a possibility to control certain subsidies, but only on goods and in a very limited way. So comparing the situation with, for instance, the strict supervision at EU level, that's clearly insufficient and gives rise to a lot of asymmetries and a level playing field. So this is the parting point. Then I will enter in how, in the later years, this has been redesigned, which are the main trends. On the national level, what we have seen is a temporal flexibilization of the screening of member state as during the crisis. And I will say that this already occurred during the financial crisis, and immediately when the crisis exploded, the Commission draw the lessons from the previous crisis and started also flexibilizing the possibility of member states to grant aid. It maintained the control, the supervision, but it flexibilized it. For instance, it raised up the threshold of what is considered to be the minimis aid. And it also opens through a temporal framework much more possibilities to grant aid. And it accelerated as well the procedures for granting that aid. It took much less and it was openly authorized. So that's basically what has happened in this national level. There are much more state aids than usual. And of course, that means more asymmetries and more distortions of competition in the single market. And that, of course, could give rise to political and economic tensions between operators in that market and also member states. A key issue, therefore, was solidarity. Solidarity between the member states, solidarity in the Union. And I wanted to reflect a bit on the degree of that solidarity and what has happened. And I'm going to do it from a double perspective, from the perspective of the conceptual framework, and then looking into practice, some practical issues. Regarding the concept of framework, what I can say is that the role for solidarity in this crisis has been much larger than before in the financial crisis. No doubt at all. Why is so? Well, I have put some possibilities, some grounds. Hopefully, I want to believe that we have learned many lessons from the financial crisis and the reaction of the Union, and now we are much better prepared, of course, because also of the advances and progress in the European Union, European Banking Union, that, of course, diminishes some of the risks, and I think the experience allow for a better reaction. In addition, in this crisis, there was no moral risk. There was no member state to blame. The asymmetries were big, but they were big because the pandemic was having a different impact on some member states and others. Italy and Spain, for instance, at the very beginning, were those countries who were more affected. And it's clear that the single market argument has played a very important role. As I said, I think that solidarity has been very important, and this is because of reasons of equity, fairness, and I think the most important one is avoiding the risk of breaking Europe, because I think that risk existed, and the risk of huge tensions between countries and between member states at the very beginning was extremely large. At least in Spain, we felt that, and unless that was solved through solidarity from the Union, I was afraid of even, I mean, I'm breaking not only the euro, but the single market itself. And if we break that, we have a break of the whole of the European integration process. So the only way to solve that was solidarity. Now, if we look into practice, and as recognizing that it has been much greater than ever before, the question, of course, is, has it been sufficient to compensate from the huge increase by particularly rich countries of national aid? I'm very optimistic here, and I'm saying that yes, it certainly, I think it has at least partially compensate to a important extent, to a very important extent, these asymmetries and these distortions, and has calmed down, of course, the potential tensions between member states at both political and economic level. You all know the importance of the recovery package, the Hamiltonian moment of the Union in this regard. We almost double European funds, the European budget, huge steps forward. The European Commission, the European Union was authorized to borrow in capital markets, certainly limiting the size of that borrowing, the duration and the scope, but still the format of that solidarity was also important because it was mainly subsidies, although also loans were contemplated. And I think it's also very innovative, the idea of this funding of the EU budget through public debt, EU public debt, sort of Eurobonds, if you want, and new European taxes, of course. And in addition, I think there is an institutional element that is very important, is that there is no unanimity and therefore no veto for disbursements of those European funds. And I think that's important. Regarding also those European funds, another element I think is very important is conditionality. And in this case, the conditionality was not so much on fiscal discipline as in the previous crisis, the financial crisis, but on certain criteria, substantive criteria, that push European goals. In particular, there are two areas which were digitalization and the green of the economy, climate change again. Of course, here there was a sort of political battle between conditionality and flexibility, and that was reflected as well in the institutional design and the decision making. Particularly who decided the payments, the disbursements, whether that should be decided by unanimity or by qualified majority, and how the battle was solved. The battle was solved through imposing qualified majority, but with an emergency brake. So the Council, on the proposal of the Commission, issues annual country-specific recommendations to member states. The member states have to adopt recovery plans. They send those to the EU. The European Commission assesses those annual recovery plans and taking into consideration, of course, the Council recommendations. And then the Council will take the decision by qualified majority. If one member state, which is a minority, considers that there is a substantive deviation, then it could call for the emergency brake and for more debate to get a consensus. But that's extraordinary. That's extraordinary. So I think here as well, we have a very important step forward. The percentage of European funds who go to climate change, to green objective is huge, and around 30% at European level. But for instance, in Spain, it's supposed to be 40%. So it's even bigger. The bet for climate change and green the economy, at least theoretically, is very, very clear. The third third element I wanted to introduce is foreign subsidies. Why? Because the Union was more and more aware of the risk of asymmetries at global level due to the existence of a strict supervision of state aid at European level and not in other jurisdictions. And it was particularly concerned on, for instance, investments coming from other third countries of companies or investors that have received public aid, or, for instance, acquisitions of EU companies by countries of third countries who have received public aid, or also the participation and success of these third country companies in public procurements in the EU due to precisely with a factor of a subsidy granted to them by their states. So there was a full reflection on how to deal with this. And of course, there were different possibilities. One possibility was the multilateral option, improving the chapter of the WTO, which the possibilities of success there were unlikely. And it's clear that nowadays the situation is insufficient and it's not going to improve in the short term. So another option was bilateral. That's always possible, and try to include that in some bilateral agreements and look for therefore at least partial solution between the relationships of the Union with certain countries. But as the Union is doing with in other fields in these later years, the Union is not stopping and is saying, well, I will also go for a unilateral measure, and I'm open to bilateral or multilateral cooperation. And it proposed a new European instrument to tackle this issue. Again, there has been a political agreement of the European Parliament and the Council on 30 June 2022. We still don't have the final text published in the official journal, but we will have it very soon. And what we know is that instrument will be directly applicable across the EU 6 months after entry into force of the regulation, and the notification obligations that it imposes will start to apply 9 months after entry into force. So think of 1.5 years, 2 years, this will be on. The main supervision that it establishes is with regard to acquisitions of EU companies, that there is a notification-based tool to investigate those concentrations and the possibility, therefore, to block them or to require certain remedies to solve the situation. Similar for public procurement. And then there's a general tool to investigate all of the market situations. So very open one, which could be applied to, well, this acquisitions of EU companies and public procurement is above certain thresholds, okay? And the general tool may allow the Commission to investigate ex officio other investments or other concentrations on public procurements below the threshold. So very open and large possibility of the Union to intervene. So which are the conclusions? The conclusions are that we are living a scenario of tectonic changes in the legal framework of public aid in Europe. Some already here and are already implemented. Some were under public consultation and they have to be published and still implemented. It will take some time. Those tectonic changes have affected both, the 3 levels, the national level, the European level, and also the global level of the foreign subsidies regimes. I think the key to all of them is first, the EU is much more demanding and given much more importance to a level playing field ad intra and ad extra. And I think solidarity and conditionality on European public goods are guiding principles of these tectonic changes. Of course, there is a caveat. We don't know what of what we have is going to remain or not, and which is the definitive scope of some of the tools. We don't have experience on the implementation of foreign subsidies. We don't know where it's going to take us. And we don't know if the temporal framework is going to be extended. For instance, with regard to European funds, I think this is a key issue, whether that, whether the result that will be considered to be very successful, and therefore we will maintain these double European funds, or that's only for the pandemic and the crisis and we are going to come back to the previous situation. So that was my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jerónimo. This is completely fascinating and very new. So I really appreciated learning about these recent developments. And we will pass over to Marta.
Thank you, Joanne, for chairing this session this morning. I would like to address in my presentation the Spanish perspective, the Spanish tax measures to counteract the economic effects on the COVID-19. And I would like also to refer to the proposed tax reform in Spain and the use of environmental taxation linking to this use of subsidies and funds and special funds in the case of Spain. First of all, let's set the framework. With the economic crisis, with the pandemic, we are like in a climate change context, in a global perspective, in a global problem. Therefore, the impact of the pandemic on the economy is a big problem. It's a problem of citizens, it's a problem to be tackled by governments, but the European Union, all are in this situation, and there are so many actors to take into consideration. The impact is absolutely clear in health. First of all, we need to finance public health services. And this was the first challenge, because the budgetary constraints in Europe are very serious, or were very serious at that time, and now more serious, whatever. But when the first problems was attended, the healthcare and to finance health services, there was the second one, the economic impact, because most of the companies, most of the workers and professional and autonomous workers were affected by the effects of the pandemic. And also we have the social issue to attend and to finance. Therefore, if we have no finance for everything, the first thing is to decide the use of the resources. There are absolutely, it is clear that there are so many different ways to react. We told yesterday about legal instruments or economic instruments, but the first one is to decide which instrument to use and in which sector. Of course, the first thing to take into consideration is the principles guiding this kind of political and economic decisions: solidarity, of course, efficiency, and to take into account budgetary constraints at national level, but also at the European level, because at that moment we are on the Euro requirements on the semester and so on. Tax administrations have reacted in a very similar way. If we read the OECD report, it is said that in that report that the same measures are be taken by tax administration, first of all, to ease the burdens on taxpayers, to support businesses, individuals with cash flow problems, because the legal obligation, the tax obligation, were already there. And also to support the problems and the difficulties in meeting tax reporting and payments obligation. In the case of Spain, as in the case of Italy and most of the European members, there has been short-term and temporary measures to enhance benefits entitlements, business cash flow, more generous tax transfers, and to support employment and other non-tax measures as subsidies. The short-term measures were mostly subsidies, as Jerónimo told us. In Spain, the state of alarm was declared in March 2020, and the first measures to tackle were general one. We have general measures, for example, the suspension of procedurals deadline. It was very, very important. First of all, the first royal decree doesn't affect tax obligation, and that was an issue at that moment, but we managed to solve these specific problems in the regulation in Spain. There are other sectoral measures. First of all, for health, for security, for traffic, for civil protection, for transport. It was an issue because we need food and everything was closed. To support vulnerable groups. Previously to the pandemic, we have a big problem in poverty in Spain, energy poverty, and with the pandemic, this situation was not precisely improved. These sectoral measures were also taken for refinancing companies, temporary employment regulation also, and so on. Regarding tax measures, that had been not a lot, but in most of the countries, and in Spain, of course, we have tax measures to address the economic impact, for example, deferral of tax payments, to address economic and social impacts, for example, the suspension of warranty enforcements, and complementary measures like deferral of custom duties and extension to deadline to litigate. For that reason, in August, all the lawyers were working at that time. Let me highlight that in the case of customs, as customs are regulated as a European level and not so much as national level, the tax administration had to follow the Commission guidelines, of course, and they were published on the website of our tax agency, which reacts very, very well in the sense of giving information to companies, citizens, and to taxpayers, of course. And you can find there the resume, the summary of the most important measures. Also, it has been important, the measures taken at that time, so as shown measures or temporary measures, to support the e-commerce, so important to provide masks and everything to the citizens. And of course, the simplification for health products in order to import this kind of sanitary products. Regarding specific tax measures, in Spain, there were some changes in VAT affecting exclusively the tax rates. We had 0% for health products, first of all, in April, but later was extended these measures. And a reduced rate for digital books, newspapers, and magazines. On the corporate income tax, there were very few changes and specific regulations, but let me quote just the extraordinary option for fraction payment. In personal income tax and in VAT, there were adopted some measures also in order to have flexibility to change the tax base for 2020, and this measure, of course, was also extended. And we have all the regulation, our urgent royal decree regarding deadlines and extending the deadlines. No? But I think these kind of temporary measures are temporary ones, but the most important thing is that the government in Spain was asked for in a group of experts for giving a proposal for a big tax reform, including environmental taxes. You can find here more information, the reaction of Spain of this kind of summaries. You can find in the webpage of the tax agency. With regard to COVID measures, our journal office includes 213 inputs of royal decree, first, second, with this kind of data, you can have an idea of the complexity of our regulation. You can find also this report from the OECD, very interesting, giving a summary of all the reactions of tax administration in the OECD. And you can find also some interesting data in the webpage of the OECD, looking for the case of Spain. And now give me, it's the turn to explain, or briefly explain, because it's more than 200 pages, what have we done with this in charge of giving a proposal of a global tax reform in Spain. The situation is that corporate tax doesn't provide sufficient resources. Yesterday, we knew by Fabrizio what are the reasons behind the problem of multinational digitalization, the schemes in tax law to tax companies. But let me only focus on the chapter of green taxation and green taxation proposal for Spain. The proposal and the explanation and the reasons to change the current situation are located on chapter 2. And the objective of this chapter is, first of all, to justify the importance of the environmental taxation in the tax reform. It was on the mandate of the government, but we found interesting to explain to the population and to give this kind of important reasons to the citizens and have it in the book, in the white book. The second objective was to have a break picture and to make a diagnosis of the current situation. And the third one was to offer a catalog of solutions to tackle the environmental problem in the short term, medium term, and long term. The chapter is structured with an introduction and conclusion, and the second part of the chapter is dedicated to explain the basis and general issues on environmental taxation. Of course, most of the concepts explained yesterday by Alice are on the book. The third subchapter was dedicated to assess the experience in Spain and providing the assessment of the environmental taxation in Spain. After that, we provide the guidelines who explain the very specific proposal, which are finally 19, not so much, because Green parties have published like, we need 200 measures on environmental taxation. And on the other part of the discussion, you have most of the people saying that we don't need environmental taxation because we have regulation. For that reason, it's important to explain, and all the explanation, I hope, is on the white book. I include in the following slides some figures to show where we are in Spain with regard to other countries. You can see that Spain is on the back, on the third position on the back regarding environmental revenues in relation to GDP. In this table, you can find the current situation of energy taxation, which is the most important tool in environmental taxation. Here in Spain, you can find the global situation depending on the figure and the type of energy, no? Gasoline, automobile, diesel, electricity, or natural gas. Then you can, Elena, compare to your figures yesterday from Italy. With these two figures, we have clear diagnosis. In Spain, we have small weight of environmental taxes and energy taxes, 1.0% versus the median 2.4% in the EU. Our current regulation is complex, and the worst is that there is no systematic at all. We have quantitative and qualitative deficiency. We have not enough money, and the figures are overlapping at national state, regional state, and sometimes with some local measures. Being local measures had the form of a tax incentive in most of the cases. The diagnosis, therefore, is clear. There is no contribution in the current regulation in Spain to climate change compromises, and the legal compromises are already there. The main messages of the White Book are two. To protect the environment is a must. It's a key issue for all the humanity, and environmental taxation should play a key role in order to implement the polluter pays principle. I include in green some of the most important messages that we would like to stress. We need gradualism in order to change for the current situation for a better one in terms of climate change objective. We have to take into account the macroeconomic context, because now is not the best moment to make big changes, of course. We need to use compensations because of the regressivity of this kind of changes, but we have to decide who compensate and the way of compensate. Of course, it's important to review each figure, each tax figure right now, and we have included some economic simulations, and that's important because after reading this chapter, you can have an idea of the impacts of each of the proposals. The principles and guidelines to propose these kind of measures were summarized in 4. First of all, we look for environmental rationale. That means that all the producers in the same situation should be taxed in the same way. Not to provide exemptions anymore, not to provide tax reduction anymore if they are not really justified. The principle is environmental taxation as it is for the ecological transition to be success. And in this sense, also it's important to remark where the priorities are. Second, principles and guidelines, consideration of regulatory setting. It's important not to make big changes in taxation without considering the regulatory framework, because taxes are a complement instrument of the regulation. And if the regulation changes, the flexibility of the tax should be at the same time helping this new regulation. We have to take into consideration specifically the Fit for 55 package in order to make proposals, and the Spanish compromises, the plan of the recovery, the plan, the national plan for the energy, and so on. In this table, you can find where the Spanish environmental commitments are, and in the last column, you can see the data. Where are the targets and where are the data? And this table shows that we have to make a big effort using also tax measures. Third principle, effectiveness. We need good practice in tax design. We don't need a bad tax, environmental tax, new taxes for nothing. And one of the most difficult tasks has been to decide which one are the priority areas. For us, the priority areas are sustainable electrification, because electrification is a must under the energy transition period. Secondly, mobility, sustainable mobility, compatible also with ecological transition. Thirdly, increasing circularity. And finally, the recognition of environmental costs associated to water use. Water was not well tackled at all, at European level, at national level. We used to have water for free, but who pays the facilities? Who pays the new installations? And this implies national level, autonomous level, and local level, and other agents in Spain, because water is a matter of bigger regulation and sharing competencies. Assessment. We have included in this chapter the revenue and emissions impacts, the distributional impacts to show who needs compensation, mostly households, and we have made a big effort in order to provide assessment, particularly in the electrification and mobility sector, because they are two specific important pieces to tackle. And in other areas, we have done generic information or no assessment because we didn't find the right data. For example, in water, it's impossible to know the costs and to give all the information in order to put on in a table. Proposals. What are the proposals? For the first area and the first objective to go to more sustainable electrification, it's important that taxes are used to remove barriers to electrification, to improve incentives, but of course, we have to cover environmental costs and quantify these environmental costs. We have proposed the elimination of the so-called 7% tax on the production of electricity, even if the Court of Justice of European Union say yes to the compatibility with the directive and the state aid law regulation. We have proposed to reduce Spanish tax on electricity and to improve some regional energy taxes and electrification taxes, because most of the environmental taxes in Spain are state at autonomous and regional level. Therefore, with this proposal, we reduce revenues from taxes. We show with tables what's happening in each figure, and the total variation in incomes, and we lose here fundings. This is just to show some figures about the distributional impact of each measure in the fields. This is work of economics. And for the second objective, mobility compatible with the transition, we have studied why and how, and to take into consideration generalized action on tax rates, on transport modes, fuels, and type of vehicles. It was really a challenge to study this kind of things. And we have proposed tax aviation, maritime and agriculture related fields. We have proposed to equalize the excise taxes on diesel and gasoline, as the Commission has pushed Spain to go further. This is not very popular, of course, measure, but it's necessary from an environmental point of view. This is the figures to show the reason of the proposals, the impact on prices, demands, and emissions. Here we increase, of course, and the distributional impact. Apart from that, we have proposed an increase, a general increase in the taxation of hydrocarbons, natural gas, and automobile fuels. And it's important to take into this consideration that we made a joint analysis with reductions of electricity transition, because both sectors are very much connected. This is the table showing the impacts on prices, demand, emissions, and revenues from the proposal 1, 3, and 6 in different sectors, residential electricity, and so on. Impacts with compensation by equivalent incomes deciles. Impacts also in urban areas with these proposals. And apart from that, we have proposed some changes in the taxes on the ownership of vehicles to promote sustainable fleet. Changes also in the tax when you buy the car to penalize polluting technologies. We are not neutral at all at that point. And we have proposed also to create a local tax on transport congestion, which take also into consideration noise pollution taxes, which is something that we forget. And we have proposed also a new charger for the use of motorways. This is more tables showing the current situation and the one after applying the proposals. The additional revenues that would have the Spanish tax in the budget. This is the table showing the effect of the increase in this tax related to cars. We have proposed also new developments in road taxation and the creation of a tax on air tickets, which are very common in Europe. This table shows the potential revenues for tax on vehicle use, a lot of money, and the impacts on prices, travelers, emissions, and revenue. I hope you understand how much work is behind this kind of pages in the white book. Third objective, increasing circularity. A new law was approved in Spain now. We have working on the proposal of this law for basically for waste and plastic. And we have proposed to extend and increase this kind of taxes included in this general law, take into account the ones who are in similar situation. That means the scope of these taxes can be extended to the similar activities to improve the environmental consideration in terms of circularity, which is other driver, different that or environmental one, with the air, reutilize and so on. And we have also proposed local taxation based in payment on waste generation. New figures, new graph to show the percentage of urban waste recycled in Spain and in the EU. And with this objective of this circularity, we have also proposed to create an aggregate tax as in Denmark. It functions in Denmark. The creation of a tax of nitrogenous fertilizers. In Spain, we have a big problem with that because there is an overuse of fertilizer, and that is not good at all for land. And we have proposed to extend and harmonize tax on emission of large industrial and cattle emitters. This is the table showing the effects in emissions, tax rates, and revenue from proposal for that kind of proposals. And finally, to incorporate the environmental costs associated to water use, we explain why this issue is so important in Spain. And we have proposed improvement in regional taxes on environmental impacts on water, to reform in charges for cost coverage of water infrastructure, and to create a tax on the extraction on water resources. This is the table showing the annual water costs and the revenues with different regional and autonomous communities in Spain. Finally, my message, not as a member of the commission, but my personal message, we need gradualists to go into this proposal. We don't propose at all to change and to go further with this 19 proposal tomorrow. But we need to go from words to facts. We need to react, or at least to modify the Spanish commitments, because the data were here. And to decide which priorities politicians like to take into consideration in a short term, mid-term, or long term. It's important, second measures, to compensate companies and households, but how? Not 100 euros for everyone in order to get the citizens very happy. Because in the end, with this kind of subsidies, we are helping French drivers who come to Spain for having better prices. And we need continuous assessment. The book is like a first step. We need more expert publishing data. This is very important. We don't have really good data in each important sector, and we need to work in teams. It's not possible to work alone from tax perspective or competition perspective or European perspective or a national perspective. We have done our work, taking into account all the reports from experts, not from tax experts, but for energy expert, and we need to work together in a multidisciplinary basis. I like very much this table because this table shows the proposals, the variation in revenues, variation in terms of emissions, and if we have done a distributional analysis. I like this picture because I think it will be very useful for the politicians in order to decide priorities. This is so important to tackle climate change objectives and to climate the right funding for the right activities that I trust it help. And thanks. And with that, I finish my presentation. Thank you very much.
So we'll just wait for Marta to stop sharing her screen, and then we'll see the people online.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Joanne, thank you, Marta. You have a very critical and wonderful presentation on the space measures.
Min, could you hold on just 1 second until Marta's ready, and then because otherwise she might not be able to hear
sorry.
you. Okay,
sorry.
Now go ahead, Min. Marta's now stopped sharing. And ready.
Thank you, Joanne. I'm very impressed on the Marta's printed wonderful presentation on the space measures to facing the public crisis. I also write a paper before. How does the Spanish government to solve the problem? But I miss the very important point. Marta mentioned the the customer measures. I want to know the customer measures. It's only used for the pandemic time, or it's used quite often. That is first question. The second question is I'm very interested in the white book you mentioned about green taxation. I got a lot of data and figures and very useful analytical framework for my further study. I have a how to say when it seems that in order to make the green transition in the future, they have more energy taxing for the company or for the firms or for the person, citizen. So that's the citizens will accept this more taxing. Thank you, Marta. Thank you, Joanne. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. With regard to customer measures, in Spain, there are more subsidies than tax incentives. And with regard the white paper and the resume on the summary of the measures regarding to energy taxes, it is not a question of increase energy taxes or reduce energy taxes. We have proposed some different measures. We have, of course, an effect. And the effect we propose is to increase energy taxes on the transport sector in order to tax the ones who pollute more and to alleviate taxation on electricity. And that's, for that reason, it is like a joint proposal. It's not a question of increasing taxes or reducing taxes. It is, of course, a question of using green taxation to have more resources, because we have the picture with the economic crisis that the direct taxation doesn't provide enough resources for the economic recovery. The data are very clear, and we need resources, but from what? And green taxation as a whole can provide new resources, but we have to do it well, right? Because it's not, the effect should be very bad for the economy, for society, and maybe for the climate change objective, if we do not take into consideration the details in regulating figures and the changes that we have proposed. I don't know if there is well answer, or do you
No,
need...
it's thank you so much. It's very clear.
Thank you.
And gave me inspiration how to understand the balance between the increased taxi or decreased taxi. That is a comprehensive package maybe in the future. Thank you, Marta. Can I ask another question for the Jerónimo?
Go ahead, Min.
Jerónimo, because I'm during the Jerónimo's presentation, my Wi-Fi was broken for some while, so I lost the chance to read the question. Jerónimo provided the legal framework for the public aid. I would like to know at that moment in the Russia-Ukraine crisis is still on the EU member states has a very high inflation rate. So how does the government to use the public aid to control or solve the high inflation program? Thank you. Joanne, it's for the Jerónimo.
Min, I didn't quite catch the question. Would you mind just asking that one more time? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And my question is now the high inflation rate, very high in the United States. So government should take measures to solve this problem. That the government can use the public aid to solve the problem, because normally once the member states was in difficult time, they usually use maneuver or use the public funding to alleviate the negative impact. That's my question.
Thank you, Min. So the sound quality is not very good, but if I understood you correctly, you're asking whether governments can use public finance in order to address the high level of inflation.
Yes, exactly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Min, for your question. I think governments can use subsidies, of course, and public aid to compensate for the negative effects on certain stakeholders of that inflation, and I think they are doing it in a way. For instance, in Spain, because of the increase, the inflation of certain public goods, certain essential goods such as electricity and energy and also food. I mean, there are certain measures that have been adopted in order to help those groups of stakeholders, particularly when they have low income, and therefore they will have difficulties to have access to those essential goods. Okay, so yes, the governments are certainly using public funds to help those groups. In principle, that should not be a problem from a state aid control perspective, because those aids, those subsidies will fit into Article 107, paragraph 2, which are automatically authorized, provided there is no discrimination regarding the origin of the goods, because it's social help or social aid for consumers. If there is no discrimination, there should be no problems. More problematic might be if the state helps companies or companies of certain sectors. Still, there might be justifications because of the very exceptional circumstances, the big impact on those companies or on those sectors of the crisis. And there are legal grounds for authorizing those public aids, but those will be under much more and strict control. Hope I have answered your question.
Thank you so much for your answer.
Let me add, if I can, that there is some tax measures on the table, but as a way of discussion, there is a lot of discussion there, is the possibility to use the tax rates in the personal income tax in order to compensate the high prices in general due to the inflation. But there is no consensus if it is a good decision or not. It's possible, yes, it's a good decision. I'm not so sure. Not for company, of course, but for individuals that in the end suffer. We are all individuals. The effects of these prices, there is, at least in Spain, a big debate, because in Spain, the tax rate in the personal income tax is shared by the state level and the regions. And some regions have proposed to intervene on these tax powers. And that's another possibility, not to use subsidies, but to use tax incentive, as whatever you want to call. And let me put on the table, I don't know if we have enough time, but just to mention one thing that I have wondered if there will be an issue in the future or not, is the proliferation of this kind of funds. At European level, I don't see any problem, but I'm not so sure what will be happen if at national level we are promoting the use of funds in order to finance everything, not being in the public budget with very much ways of controlling it, but putting this kind of funds in another parafiscal, we can call that parafiscality, and this is not so good in terms of financial tax law, because it is risky to comply with essential constitutional principles, which are the control, the principle of legality, and so on. And this proliferation of funds at national level have to be taken into consideration, because we need good results. And if we have good controls for budget, not so good in some countries, but if we extended this kind of funding, I'm not so sure that the assessment and the control will be in a good end. That's another thing that suggests me the presentation of Jerónimo.
I think we're going to have to finish. Listening to Marta makes me realize that the UK is more of a failed state than I'd realized before with this incredible set of proposals. And so really start to write some blogs to keep us updated on what happens with the developments, which are really fascinating. And with Jerónimo, I've been watching a BBC documentary, a series called Inside the European Union, 10 Years of Turmoil. And as I listen to you, I'm thinking what a contrast there is between the last 2 years and the year of the financial crisis, with the conditionality and the riots in Greece and so on. So I'm looking forward to this next step being made into the documentary so we can see a more positive face, fingers crossed, of the European Union. So another fantastic session. Thank you very much to both of our speakers and to Min for her questions and to our audience. And we will start back again at quarter to 12. So in 30 minutes, we'll have a coffee break and see everybody back in just under half an hour. Okay, so after 2 weeks, we now arrive at our final session of the summer school here at the EUI in Florence. And we have as a final treat of the day, a session with Eduardo Traversa, as well as with Marta Villar. Marta, everybody knows by now, but Eduardo, I will just say a few words. Eduardo, you are there, I think. Buongiorno, Eduardo.
Hello.
Hello. Eduardo is a professeur ordinaire of tax and European law at UCLouvain. He has his doctorate from just up the road, the University of Bologna. And he, as well as being a professor, he is also an avocat and consults regularly on issues of public policy relating to tax with national governments and also the European Union. For example, he's a member of the EU VAT group and the European Platform for Good Tax Governance. So it's a privilege to have you here with us today, Eduardo, and the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, everyone. I'm very happy to be here, virtually, unfortunately. I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me?
We hear you very well.
Wonderful, wonderful. So after the great Madrid event 2 weeks ago, now we are in Florence discussing other topics related to the relationship between EU and China. What I would like to do together with Marta during this session is to launch a discussion about the future of the EU own resources system, also having a look at how environmental taxation is evolving. And the issue that we will be discussing is to what extent, from a legal perspective, environmental taxes may be, or environmental contribution, may be used to fund the EU budget. I know that some topics within this more general issue have already been discussed, in particular CBAM, so I won't touch upon it. We'll have, together with Marta, two, let's say, subtopics to discuss. One is present, is the plastic contribution, as it has been already adopted and has been added to the own resources. And the second topic is how we could reform the VAT on resource in order to have a more environmentally friendly VAT that could also be used to fund the budget. I'll share my slides. Second. Okay. You can see them. Okay, can you see the slides?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. Okay. So first of all, it's important to have in mind when we discuss about own resources, the fact that unlike what is happening in states, in member states or in other states around the world, there is no link between the EU budget and the taxing competences, not powers, of the European Union, which is linked to historical peculiarities and the fact that the EU is an international organization and not yet a federal state. But nevertheless, there are some links between the EU competences in the area of taxation and the way the EU budget is financed. So this is an overview. So figures from 2019, but it didn't change that much of the EU budget. So you have an idea of how much 163 billions and 64 billion euros, and the budget is financed mainly through 4 types of resources. With in gray on the slide, you can see that almost 2/3 of the EU budget is financed through the GNI, based on resource, which has no link with taxing powers, either from the member states or from the EU. But still, you can see that through customs duties, VAT, I'll discuss that later, there are tiny links with the EU competences in the area of taxation. And moreover, there are no links except, and we will see the plastic contribution with EU competencies in the area of environmental policy. So that it's not ideal, considering how important the Green Deal is for the current.
Eduardo?
Yes?
So the sound is coming and going a bit. If you could keep your voice close to the microphone,
Yes,
that would be excellent.
yes. Okay. I'm keeping my voice now close to the microphone. Can you hear me?
Now we hear you better. Thank you.
Okay, okay. So I was just saying that there are no links between the EU competences in the area of taxation, the EU competences in the area of environmental policy, and the way the EU budget is funded. That is also to give you an overview of the share of the different member states in the EU budget, without too many surprises. The bigger member states are the bigger contributors, but it is true that when it comes the debate on own resources is a very difficult debate, because some member states have the impression that they are contributing more than they receive independently from their size, which forces the Commission and the negotiators to try to be creative and to propose resources that cannot be too much linked to the territory of the member states, in order to make them more acceptable. And CBAM was a good example. This is just something that you probably already know. It's just the recent history of the reform of the own resource system, which 2 years ago, this very important 2020 summer, where there was an important overhaul of how the EU is financed. That also, that not only the borrowing capacity of the European Union has been substantially leveled up, but also there was an agreement on new own resources, the plastic tax, or plastic contribution, sorry, plastic contribution, and also an agreement on discussing further the possibility of creating new own resources, and the discussion is still ongoing. The Commission should propose by the end of next year, 2023, new own resources beyond CBAM. This is a chart where I tried to link the existing own resources with the taxing competencies of the European Union. As you can see, 2/3 of the total GNI own resources is nothing to do with taxes, but interestingly enough, there are some links that are worth underlying. Customs duties, of course, which are an integral part of foreign trade policy of the EU, but also VAT. VAT is a harmonized tax, but at the same time, one of the contributions, one of the own resources is calculated, taking into account the VAT taxable basis in each member state with some corrections, and at least in its original intent, the idea was to link the VAT harmonization with the creation of a new own resource. What I'll propose later is try to go back to this original intent, adding an environmental dimension. But before that, I think it's important to underline that it is time to rethink the system of own resources, because there are certain democratic shortcomings that should be corrected before the EU integration goes further. The fact that we still have a funding system which is typical of international organizations without the intervention of the EU Parliament when it comes to discussing the taxing competences of the European Union, or without any link between tax policy and budgetary policy, which has as a consequence that the EU level never bears the financial consequences of tax policy choices decided at the EU level, constitute a problem. And it's a time also, I think, to clarify a bit the division of powers in the area of taxation between the European Union and the member states. I don't think that it is very healthy policy to have taxes as important as, for example, VAT that are completely split when it comes to the legislative function between the EU and the member states. You all know that VAT is largely harmonized at the EU level, but nevertheless, member states retain powers, legislative powers, whether on the fixation of the rates, on the determination of important exemptions, for example, when it comes to taxation of immovable property, of financial services, and the fact that we have also still 27 tax administration that are working more or less autonomously one from another is certainly not positive, at least in the taxpayer's view, because it leads to different treatment of same transactions in a cross-border context. It may lead also to double taxation situation, which are very difficult to solve. First discussion that we would like to have with you, Marta and I leave Marta introduce the discussion, is whether the introduction of a plastic contribution fundamentally alters the way the EU own resources system works, and whether this can be seen as a first step toward a more like a greener EU budget. I leave Marta continue.
Thank you, Eduardo. Just to put into the table some data, this is from 1 January 2021, that this new EU own resource based on non-recycled plastic packagings has been introduced by a new own resource decision adopted by the Council in 2020. It is important to remark that it is a national contribution from member states proportional to the quantity of plastic packaging waste that is not recycled. On this decision, it is well defined the concept of plastic packaging waste. Article 2 of the decision tells us that it means products made by polymers to which additives or other substances may have been added, whose aim is to contain, protect, handle, deliver, or present other products, including single use. It is important to remark that because the definitions are at the level of the EU. And it's not mandatory to compare this kind of definitions with these national tax measures that has been put in place in Spain and in Italy, and in the UK, of course, too. These new resources give the rise to many questions and many issues from political, financial, legal point of view. First of all, its nature. It is, I would like to remark that, to my view, it is a contribution without fiscal nature, but it reinforced the incentive for member states to take actions in order to reduce plastic waste, but also in order to reduce, logically, their contributions to the European budget. It is not mandatory, it is not required to introduce a tax at national level. It is not mandatory in directive regulation, but it is not mandatory in this council decision, neither. But some member states have decided to introduce a tax with different scopes. It's important to remark that because on the process to have the yes of the to be this new regulation in force, there were so many changes in the process that this is important to be remarked. The tax measures at national level are related to two objectives. First of all, to tackle plastic pollutions, and secondly, to raise revenue, but at national level. This new own resources is not surprising at all, because I think in Europe we had so many strategies, proposals, and regulation to tackle waste and plastic pollution. And this new own resources is very much related to circular economy. It is known so with the proposals to have ETS or CBAM as a new resource. The framework for these new resources is clear, is circular economy, which is now on the top of the European agenda, on the national strategies also. Let me end with some considerations that have been included in a reflection paper from the Commission in 2017. The Commission told us which are the criteria to be into consideration in order to introduce new resources. And let me quote 6 of them. First of all, transparency. If we take into consideration this criteria, we have to say that this new EU own resources is transparent, as it is based on Eurostat data. Therefore, in order to assess this new criteria with the requirements made by the Commission, I have to say it's okay, it's fine. Secondly, simplicity. I think it's simple to say that each member state have to pay to the European budget 0.18 euros per kilogram of non-recycled plastic packaging. And this is very much related to the waste directive too. Third, stability. We have to say no. We do not have a stability resource and financial related to the new criteria, because if member states as well, the financial resources will decrease, of course. Consistency with the European policy objectives. We have to assess the new resources, saying yes, it is very much related to the European policies. The criteria number 5, the impact on competitiveness and sustainable growth. We will see. I don't have nowadays any data, any criteria to make this adjustment. We will see. Depending, to me, it depends very much on the scope of the new national taxes, of course, in order to promote this environmental objective. And finally, the equitable breakdown among member states. And that's all for my part, because the new resources will follow. This is a new resource already in force. I have to remark that. And to me, I don't know if we can discuss on that, it's a good decision, because it's at least a first step in order to change the framework and to tackle climate change objectives. Thank you, Traversa. Professor Traversa, you can continue if you want.
Thank you. Thank you, Marta. I'm wondering whether this new resource is significant and sustainable. I have the impression that the amount of revenue expected is rather low, plus the fact that it does not seem, based on existing national experience, so easy to administer simply count the amount of plastic waste generated on a territory, and if this contribution has to be implemented in the form of a tax, how viable is that tax? Is it easy to administer? What would be the potential compliance costs, collecting costs also for the administration? Would it lead to potential border controls or indirect border controls? Those are, let's say, unanswered questions. I don't know if people in the audience have an opinion or that on, or an experience to share, but I have doubts.
Alice want to make some remarks.
Yeah, hi Eduardo. It's good to see you, even though it's online. Would be nicer if you were here, but I'm sure we'll have the chance to meet again in person. Yeah, I don't have clear answer to your questions, but I worked a little bit on the UK plastic tax when it was proposed. And I agree with you and your concerns regarding the complexity that might be hidden behind that kind of proposal, because it sounds very simple, but even just the definition of what's plastic and what kind of plastic should fall into the scope of such a tax is super complicated. I have a good friend in Oxford who is actually was your PhD student, Joanne, who has been working on a project on plastic with people doing chemistry. And it really, really highlights the complexity of such measures. My other concern is more about the symbolic message it sends to member states when it comes to the EU own resources, because it sounds like a punishment. So if you are asked to contribute to the EU budget through the plastic contribution, it basically means that you are producing more plastic waste, which you shouldn't do. So it sort of sends a signal that contributing to the EU budget is, yeah, a sanction. And I don't think that's the right message that the EU wants to send to the member states, because if we want a serious EU budget, we should make sure that member states are actually happy to contribute to the European budget. But of course, that's ideal. I mean, we know that member states try to spend the least amount they can on the European budget.
If I can say something, I think in the UK, the process was a large process of discussion. And you have received in the UK a lot of inputs from companies, from most of the concerns about the scope, the definition of plastic, and it was not the case in Spain or in Italy, because the process was long, but not so long to get all the information from the final taxpayers. All the considerations you have made, I fully agree with you, but I think in the case of Spain, the final law have considered these consequences that Eduardo was mentioned before, how to tackle with importation and exportation and so on. And it has been decided to administrate as a VAT. Then the administration process should be not so complex. We will see, because the taxpayers, as always, don't want a new tax. And they have the sense that they are assuming so many costs that the government have to take into consideration, and they have perceived this new Spanish tax as a penalty too, as you mentioned, that could be received from member states too. And this is always the debate on the table around contributions we have this environmental objective of purpose, because the common sense of everyone is to say how to now regulate, how to not tackle with fiscal measures. That's the main point, I think. But the sensibility for citizens, I think, is also a very good message. We will see, because the Spanish tax will be enforced next year. Therefore, that means that we have no experience. Maybe in the UK, as you have a long period of debates, you have more inputs of the real concerns of this kind of measures. But we will see. We will see. It's very early to assess. Thank you.
Could I ask a question? And then I haven't got my glasses on, so I'll have to log on to Zoom to ask the question that's on screen, because I can't. But so just a question that tries to relate it a bit to the Chinese experience. So I know nothing about these proposals, but I do remember that there was a very important decision taken by the Chinese government some years ago to prohibit the importation of plastic waste which could not be recycled. And I wonder to what extent that measure adopted by the Chinese state has driven, or at least is partly responsible for driving the EU in this direction. Now, while this question is being answered, I'm going to log on to Zoom, and then I'm going to ask the question on behalf of the person who wrote a question in chat, because my eyesight is not good enough to read it from where I am. Eduardo, do you want to respond to Alice's comments and or answer my question? Likewise, Marta, and then I will look at chat. Eduardo, would you like to comment at all? Or would you like to respond to Alice's comments or to answer my question? No obligation, but just if you would like to.
Yes. I don't know if the Chinese decision to ban imports of plastic has played a role. I know that other countries, I think Indonesia too, have taken similar decisions. Certainly the fact that it's becoming more difficult to export waste around the world forces Europe to take a step in that direction. Certainly the positive element is that after 40 years, we have an additional own resource, whatever it is, and that there is a link with environmental policy. Those are two important elements. The problem also that I see is that in countries like Belgium, for example, those taxes are usually not taxes but fees that are allocated to a fund or that are used to foster recycling of those products. And by imposing a contribution which goes to the overall EU budget, it leaves much less leeway for member states to organize a system of real contributions by plastic producers and plastic users to foster recycling. And that is a policy point. Probably it would have been more adequate to provide for even for EU contribution of plastic, but an obligation for the EU to use the revenues received for policies related to plastic recycling or fostering research on alternative products, less polluting, and therefore I agree with the idea that Alice put forward, that this is sounds more like a punishment than a real effective policy tool in order to, in a broader EU plastic policy.
Just before you come in, Marta, I'm just going to read the question from online because perhaps you will want to say something in relation to that too. So Pech Prakai writes in the chat, my point of view is that there will not be many there will not be much direct revenue from the new resources, but the outcome of it will help to reduce future plastics waste, which will particularly help reduce extraction of natural resources, which in turn may help to prevent future expense required to mitigate or solve problems from the effects of waste in the environment and society. So the revenues will not be so big, but nonetheless, it could have an impact in reducing plastics waste. So thank you for that comment. Marta.
Thank you, Jan. I think we should distinguish direct and indirect effect. And maybe if we can agree with this sense of punishment perceived by the member state, there is this indirect effect that has been put now on the comment from the audience. I also want to mention the hierarchy, the waste hierarchy. It is important to promote recycling and the use on packaging of recycling products. This is not only the problem of plastic at itself, but the problem of packaging using recycling products. And I think it's important to take into consideration the hierarchy and the specific principles on waste and on plastics, which is very specific one under the general principles of environmental policies, which is the precautionary principle or the polluter pays principle. Because this is not question of perceiving this contribution or the obligation to pay as a punishment if there is a fiscal obligation, because tax is not a punishment. And yeah, could be perceived as such, of course, but we should as academic to remark the differences, at least in the regulation. Of course, we can perceive this regulation and open the debate, but the nature of the contributions are very different, and we have to split it. Just to remark these kind of issues. Thank you.
Okay, so I will open the floor to other comments or questions from the audience, but also from our speakers. So would anybody else like to jump in with comments or questions on the topic of this session? Eduardo?
Yes, on the comment of Pech Pakai, well, if the instrument is seen as a regulatory instrument, it might be worth discussing the indirect effects on plastic production. But in this particular case, it is an EU own resource. So the primary objective and the only objective should be to fund the EU budget. And the problem is that if that measure is successful in forcing member states in reducing production of plastic, well, it's bad news for the EU because it will be, let's say, wasted wasted legislative work because the primary objective of creating an additional own resource won't be met due to potential declining revenue linked to the positive indirect effects on plastic production. So if it were a purely domestic measure or a measure that wouldn't be linked to the own resources, I think it would be very interesting to count of those indirect consequences in order to meet the policy of the environmental policy objective. But here, the fact that it is a EU own resources for the EU, financial stability would lead to think that it would be better that the indirect consequences wouldn't be so positive, which is a kind of paradox for that kind of measure.
Marta.
Yes, just to add the importance of the perception of this kind of measures at a European level or national level, which is the use of the revenues and linking the use of the revenues with the financement of the environmental policies. And specifically in this case, that should be an idea to link to the financement of the waste policies, administrative management, or the plastic policies. And these kind of considerations are very much linked to the theory of the double dividend, or in using green tax reforms, or in better perceiving the need to pay taxes, or in this case to contribute to the European budget. Maybe this is more transparent measures if you link the use of the resources with political environmental consideration. Just to remark, this is important, not at European level, but also as a general consideration at national level or whatever.
Great, thank you. And Petrakai responds, thank you, I see your point. I even think that this new resource is not a long-term one, because in the future we want to reduce the amount of plastics waste that is generated, which I think is exactly the point that Marta was making when she raised an issue about the stability of the tax. So that's a helpful contribution, thank you. Other questions or comments? If I can ask a couple of questions, since there's a silence, I've asked too many questions over the course of the last few days, so if other people want to go first, I'm very happy. And I'm not an expert in this area, so I'm enjoying the opportunity to quiz my colleagues. So I just want to hear people who are working in this area say a little bit more about the changing political dynamics post-pandemic of the idea of taxing for EU own resources. Are there still member states who are standing against that idea, as Denmark has in the past, for example, or has the pandemic really led to a different political dynamic within the EU? And then my second question, which takes us back to yesterday, but Eduardo may also, I think, have something to say about this, as well as Alice. I just would like to hear a little bit more about the question of when revenues raised should accrue not to the EU member states or to the EU itself, but rather to countries outside the EU. So this is something that Alice touched on yesterday in relation to CBAM, but which arises also in relation to the ETS more generally. So you told us yesterday, Alice, that the European Parliament is pushing for some of the CBAM revenues to be transferred to reallocated, or maybe allocated rather than reallocated.
Yeah, they still say they want the fund to go to the EU budget, if I'm not mistaken, but they indicate that ideally the EU should invest or should use part of the funds to support those countries. And I think there is a distinction, because it means that it first goes into the European pot, and then they decide what they will do with the money. So yeah.
I agree with you. It's incredibly important. I didn't realize that, because also with the principle of common but differentiated responsibility, the idea that the money is flowing from poor countries to rich countries, and then the rich countries decide what they're going to do. So that's interesting. So Eduardo, I don't know whether you have anything that you want to say, and also I will try and collect some more questions and comments from other people.
Yes, there was clearly a shift in EU tax policy in the recent years. The pandemic has played a role, but other events like Brexit, like the fight against tax avoidance of multinational companies, have, let's say, shifted the priority of EU tax policy. For a long time, harmonization of a domestic tax system was the priority. Then, since the early 2000s, fight against tax fraud and avoidance with increased administrative tax cooperation and protection of the taxable base of the EU member state has become a priority. And now we can see that with Brexit, the advantage from an EU perspective is that it is possible to discuss further harmonization in the area of corporate tax, and even to discuss linking tax policy and EU own resources. It doesn't mean that member states agree to change the current system, but certainly that there is no veto to even discuss the topic, which was the case before the UK was, until the UK was member of the EU. The pandemic has had as an effect that many member states recognize now that there is an increased value, an added value in more EU spending, which is an very important first step towards additional EU own resources, but it's not a necessary step, because as we can see with Next Gen, there are alternative ways of financing the EU, which is through loans and borrowing. At the moment, the discussion on new taxes to fund the EU budget is on the table, and there is an interesting controversy, let's say, between lawyers and economists on the topics, because I had the opportunity to discuss the issue, and for example, that the idea we'll present now on transforming the VAT in a true own resource with economists, and economists told, well, it would be better to create new taxes, because existing taxes are already used by EU member states, and EU member states do not want to lose present actual resources. But with the lawyer's eyes, that is a very bad thing, because nobody likes taxes and nobody likes even less new taxes. And the idea of creating new taxes just to fund the EU is, from, let's say, a lawyer's perspective, a very bad idea for at least two reasons. The first one is an administrative reasons and legislative reasons. Creating a tax is always a tricky exercise. You need to have tax administration that know how the tax works. And when it is new, it takes months, sometimes years, before they are used to collect the tax. When you do that at the EU level, it's even more difficult than at the domestic level. And from a, let's say, legitimacy and compliance point of view for the EU citizens and businesses, creating a new tax is a very hard task. And when you look at history, the creation of new taxes has always necessitated, from a political point of view, extraordinary events. So usually wars. We have a war now in Europe, but I don't think it's something that we would like to wish. We should wish to have additional new taxes. So there is a kind of controversy between economists and lawyers on the topics, and between also politicians. My view is that we should work on existing taxes to transform them and to allocate in a clearer way part of the revenues generated by those taxes to the EU budget, and reducing the national contribution. But it's a minority view. At the moment, the EU and the member states are working on new taxes because they think that it will be easier to have them adopted. For example, an extra tax on multinationals, or CBAM, or digital tax, all those new levies that would give the impression to European citizens that they won't pay them, that others will pay them, because the best tax is the tax paid by other taxpayers. But it's rarely the case, actually. When you discuss about the economic effects on digital taxes, taxes on companies, at the end of the day, stakeholders, workers, consumers always share part of the burden of the new tax. But let's say from a political perspective, it's sometimes easier to sell in the first place. Although we shouldn't be concerned only on the narrative, we should be concerned also on the real effects on those new taxes.
Thank you very much for giving such a nice insight into the world of the tax lawyer, which is fascinating. Marta.
Just to add to the comment of Eduardo that I also share, that there is very important to have a pre-assessment and post-assessment, and to know very, very well all the costs, the administrative one, if we would like to propose a new tax. It's extremely important. And in Spain, we had some experiences, interesting experiences regarding the plastic bag taxes, which are not functioning at all. They are put in force at a regional level, and at least the cost of the administrate the tax was so high that the best is not to have the tax in force in the end. This kind of assessment, this kind of experiences, and the comparative experiences are very, very much important in order to propose new taxes, as well as national level or at European level, which is quite more difficult to have. Pre-assessment is the important point that I would like to remark.
Thank you, Marta. We have another comment in the chat. Maria Amparo says, I agree with Eduardo, less taxes and better design and management or adjustment of the existing ones. Blaming the EU on the creation of new taxes is an easy argument for politicians, as I know only too well, sitting here with my British accent. Also, the new taxes, allocating revenue would help supervision. Also, the new taxes may have negative interactions, sometimes overlooked, with the rest of the tax system. So I don't know if anybody would like to, Eduardo or Marta would like to comment on Maria's comments. I mean, she's essentially agreeing with Eduardo, so he'll probably just put his thumb up.
I agree.
And then
I also agree.
So we have an unusual consensus, and certainly the Brexit issue. You know, if we think about the issue that the EU's finances played in Brexit, I absolutely think Maria is correct on that point. Min, I think you may want to jump in.
Thank you, Joanne, and thank you, Eduardo and Marta. I also fully agree with your viewpoints on the taxi. It keeps the existing taxi framework, and readjust the new. If we want to add the new taxi, we should be really think it over. And I'm also interested in the Marta's comments. You mentioned in Spain, the Spanish case, for the plastic bag. It happened in China. Our government always have the policy to the control use more plastic and plastic bags. But after some period of time, people, it cannot, it doesn't function well, because the citizens, the companies, the firms, or the restaurants, they they do not care about the qualities, qualities of plastic bags used. Also, the companies or factories, they use the overused the decorated materials. So I think maybe taxi is not a useful way to control the people's behavior for in terms of some plastic materials, because we still now we didn't care about the plastic bags because it's cheaper if you do not carry the renewable bags to the supermarket. You can buy the plastic bags. It's cheap. You can. So also we go to the supermarket or go to the free market, they will give you plastic bags free of charge. So how to solve this problem? Because it's not only the taxi problem. Maybe it's the awareness for the whole society. Thank you, Marta.
Yeah, just to add it is important to remark also the rate of the tax. If you pay 1 centime, that's not enough to get the right signal to the market. It's, of course, I fully agree.
Thank you, Min, for bringing us back to the consumer perspective, which is always an important perspective in tax law. So Jerónimo has a question.
Yes, I wanted to link this with the temporary character of the situation that we are living now, and the temporary solution. So we have been seeing that many of the solutions that are being taken are taken only with that temporary scope, and it is still to be decided whether they will be extended or not. And in that, with that in mind, what I would like to ask the speakers is, how do you see the possibility first of extending that? So to maintain an important EU budget, and particularly from a more technical perspective, if you will be promoting that, which alternatives will you be using? More reforming the tax system, as you have seen, as you have been saying, or also, I mean, looking for direct public debt of the European Union. Which alternatives do you see that are better from a technical point of view and more feasible from a political perspective? Thank you very much.
So Marta, you want to go first, and then Eduardo?
Yeah, it's so difficult question that I have no answer at all. I think tax is just a complementary tool. It will be not substitute to other policies. If you have to prohibit, then prohibit plastic. If you have to communicate a right signal to the consumers, then you can use the tax. But in this case, you should have a very good, well-designed tax, because if not, the direct and indirect effects will be worse. And that is theoretically speaking, but we can say the same considerations at national level or at EU level. At EU level, it's impossible go further because we have always the unanimity rule as a great limitation. But I'm very much concerned also about the conditionality of the funds. I think these new own resources, I'm not so much in favor, but I have to understand why, and this is my role. But I think the conditionality of receiving funds for a national point of view in using these funds in an ecological and digital way in order to finance the best ways of invest, it's important, because in the end, companies will not receive any money if they don't follow this kind of requirements. And this is at local level, regional level, national level, and it is a statement coming from the EU. I don't know if citizens perceive very well that the funds given at a national level are coming from the EU budget, and all should be connected. I don't know if I have answered, but just sharing with you my perceptions.
Thank you, Marta. Very clear indeed. So now we turn to Eduardo.
Yes, to answer, or try to answer Jerónimo's concerns. It is true that the main reason why member states agreed to open the discussion of additional own resources was the temporary nature of the next generation plan, and the fact that at some point money borrowed by the Commission should be repaid, and repaid with the EU budget, and if the EU budget wasn't sufficient, with member states' contributions. And of course, facing the possibility of having to pay back EU debt, member states were more keen on discussing additional own resources. Two remarks. First of all, when it comes to public debt, usually the issue is not so much about repaying it. May happen, but it happens rarely, but of refinancing it, and refinancing it at affordable rates, which would allow in the future to create even more debt. So that's how usually it works. In that context, additional own resources are necessary, not so much to have enough money to repay the debt, but to make sure that the EU is a credible borrower. To a certain extent, taxing powers can be seen as a guarantee for creditors, state creditors, that interest will be paid and potentially debt. The fact that the EU has such a tiny budget compared to the EU GDP, and certainly compared also to the amount that have been borrowed through the next gen, is not seen positively by the markets. So the idea of having increased own resources is necessary to make the EU a credible creditor in the future. A second element is that the pandemics and other events show that there is a need for direct EU spending in a number of areas that member states are not even the bigger one strong enough, solid enough to finance climate change or defense policy or other policies, and therefore their additional resources are needed. And it's not a sound policy to count only on debt to finance, let's say, current expenses. You may use debt to fund big investments projects, on long-term investments project. But when it comes to, for example, fund an embryo of EU army or defense force in the future, those are current expenses, and you need money to do that, and recurrent money, and you cannot count on debt. So I think that there are good arguments also to have more revenues coming from own resources. And last argument is the dependency towards member states. The fact that 2/3 of the budget comes from direct contribution of the member states is not a good thing, let's say, in a pre-federal setting, when it comes to having a true autonomy of the EU level towards the member states. And then sometimes it is necessary. It is necessary that EU institutions understand they are not just there to help the member states achieving their own goals. Sometimes there is an EU interest which has to be rated above the interest of some EU member states, and having truly own resources really helps taking decisions for the EU common good, and not for the good of the most influential member states. But of course, it's a difficult process. That's why I think it would be better to build on the existing harmonization, tax harmonization process, and to develop it further than to create out of the blue new own resources. And I think that VAT could be much better used in order to become a true European tax whose revenues would be shared between the EU and the member states. That's how it is the case in Germany, for example. In Germany, VAT, but also the personal income tax, corporate income tax, are taxes that are adopted by the Bund, so by the federal government, but that are equally shared. The revenues are equally shared between the Bund and the Länder. And we could even imagine to have a system where actually 90% of the revenues collected through this true EU VAT would be redistributed or kept by the member states, because we could perfectly work with domestic tax administrations, domestic tax administration collecting an EU tax, keeping not 30% like custom duties, but 90% of the revenues, and then 10% would accrue to the EU budget. And even more, but that's a more radical proposal that I'm making, we could add within the VAT a green dimension, saying that the VAT collected on the goods and services that would be sold within the EU, the VAT collected would consist of two rates, a rate like today based on the price of the goods and services sold, but also an extra green rate that would be based on the nature of the product, and based on an index, let's say, of pollution that would take into account CO2 emission, but also pollution of soil, of water, based on the life cycle analysis, which is a technique that has been developing for years by, let's say, hard scientists, and which progresses show that in the future it should be possible to categorize the various products and services according their impact on the environment. And moving into that direction would greatly simplify the system, because we would have one single VAT throughout Europe. We would have still a large part of the revenues accruing through the member state, and we would insert an environmental dimension on a tax that it is collected on all goods and services. And that would allow to limit, not avoid completely, but to limit this discriminating effect of having green taxes just on certain products, because all products have an impact on the environment, some more than others. But having a plastic tax or a tax on certain types of fuels or certain types of other types of goods create this discriminating effect with risk of substitutions, effects that are not politically easy to administer, but also from a legal perspective are not also easy to deal with. So I think there is a great potential with VAT, which is already part of the EU resource system or indirectly and part of the harmonized EU harmonization process. But unfortunately, it's not, at the moment, it's not discussed. It's not discussed by policymakers because they think that there is no possibility in this tax, but that's a pity, and I would like it to change in the future.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. And Prakai, I think you will agree that Eduardo read your mind, in fact, and has managed to significantly answer the question you asked about VAT on Zoom. So thank you, Eduardo. I don't know if you had seen the question, but you did manage to address it in significant
That's telepathy.
At any rate. So thank you, Prakai, for that question also. We're actually out of time, so I am going to thank once more Eduardo and Marta for a really wonderful session. I've learned a huge amount, and I am going to give them a round of applause with everybody. And then I'm going to pass the floor to Jerónimo for a final brief remark before we close our 2 weeks of the summer school.
Thank you very much, Joanne. Yes, I didn't want to close this wonderful 2 weeks summer without thanking everyone who has been involved in the summer. First, of course, our host, the EUI. Thank you very much to Professor Joanne Scott. Thank you very much to Francesca Grassini. Couldn't have been more efficient and more lovely. Thank you very much to all the other administrative staff who has been involved in the EUI, the technicians as well. I would like also to thank you very much the European Commission, of course, for funding this Jean Monnet Network EU-China. And the partners, all the partners, starting by our Chinese partners here, very well represented by Professor San Min. Thank you very much for the involvement of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in the summer. It was so nice to have you in practically all sessions, and not only you, but also other Chinese researchers who were working in the different fields that we have been tackling. This has been wonderful. Thank you very much, Min. Thank you very much. I will also like, of course, to thank the other partners, Food and in China, and particularly the European ones as well, Université Catholique de Louvain, University College London, for their involvement as well in the summer. All the speakers, we have speakers not only from the partners, but from all many universities, and the attendance, of course. And finally, I want also to thank you very much, the Royal Institute for European Studies at CEU São Paulo University. There's a lot of people who have been involved, who have been working very hard. They are not here, but Loreto Maches, Javier Porras, and many other people from the staff have been involved in the Jean Monnet Network, and in particular in this summer. And I'm very, very grateful to all of them. Of course, as well to Marta Villar, one of the co-directors of the summer, who, as always, has been very active, and it has been wonderful again to have you here, Marta. So.
And I will just add, in the famous words of Eduardo, a big thank you to Jerónimo for the tremendous amount of work and determination he put into the project. So thank you very much. And Francesca, you were absent when you were thanked. So I will say yet again that Jerónimo was grateful to you. We are all grateful to you for all the work that you've done over the past 2 weeks. So thank you once again.